Good evening, mystery lovers. Tonight, in the quiet English market town of Flaxborough, a prize cucumber vanishes from the Horticultural Show, leading to revelations that culminate precisely at midnight. But is this truly murder, or simply the tidy elimination of a very English sort of corruption? Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? London, New York, or somewhere delightfully unexpected? Do let us know. The Flaxborough Annual Horticultural Show possessed, in the opinion of those who attended it religiously, a dignity that was both municipal and eternal. Held each September in the Market Hall, a building that had witnessed everything from cattle auctions to amateur theatricals with the same expression of patient endurance. It represented the sort of English institutions that survived by being simultaneously important and ridiculous. This particular evening, the hall buzzed with the subdued excitement that accompanies any event where reputations hang upon the circumference of a marrow or the precise shade of a dahlia. The committee, in a burst of progressive thinking that had startled even themselves, had decided upon an evening show to accommodate the working classes, though the working classes, with their customary perversity, had largely failed to appear. Instead, the usual congregation of retired bank managers, councillors' wives, and persons of independent means circulated among the trestle tables with the measured tread of pilgrims approaching a shrine. Mrs. Dorothea Collop, whose authority in matters horticultural was exceeded only by her certainty in all other affairs, surveyed the assembled exhibits with the satisfaction of a general reviewing troops. Her particular domain was the flower section, where her prize-winning roses held court with the sort of regal presence that suggested they were quite aware of their superiority. She had, over the years, developed the ability to detect inferior blooms at considerable distance, a skill that proved equally effective when applied to inferior people. "The standard this year," she announced to Mrs. Pettigrew, who was adjusting the label on her somewhat modest display of sweet peas, "is really quite exceptional, though I do think Mr. Crask's gladioli are rather assertive." Mr. Crask, who operated the town's principal jewellery establishment and held strong opinions about London that were not charitable, had indeed produced gladioli of an almost military bearing. They stood in their vase like soldiers on parade, their colours so vivid they seemed to challenge the very concept of subtlety. Mr. Crask himself, a thin man with spectacles that caught the light in a manner suggesting perpetual vigilance, hovered nearby with the air of someone prepared to defend his horticultural honor against all comers. The vegetable section, however, was dominated by a single magnificent presence, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon's prize cucumber. It lay upon a bed of green baize like a verdant scepter, its proportions so impressive that several visitors had been observed measuring it with their eyes and shaking their heads in what might have been admiration or despair. Mr. Penhaligon, whose chain of hardware stores had made him a man of substance in more ways than one, stood beside his triumph with the sort of proprietary pride that suggested he had personally supervised every stage of the cucumber's development. 18 inches. He was explaining to anyone within earshot, and perfectly straight. No easy achievement, I can tell you. The secret is in the feeding, a little-known mixture of my own devising. Inspector Purbright, who had been persuaded to open the show by a combination of civic duty and the impossibility of refusing Mrs. Collop, found himself examining a display of preserves with the careful attention of a man who had learned that social occasions in Flaxborough often revealed more than their organizers intended. He noted the way Mrs. Higgins's smile tightened whenever anyone praised a rival's jam, the manner in which young Timothy Baxter kept glancing toward the adult's vegetables with barely concealed envy, and the curious fact that Mr. Holroyd, the town's undertaker, was spending an unusual amount of time studying the prize cards with what appeared to be professional interest. The evening's formalities began with Mr. Henderson, the show's chairman, rising to address the assembled company. He was a man whose retirement from banking had left him with a surplus of dignity and a tendency to treat all occasions as if they were board meetings that had somehow got out of hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the sort of authority that comes from years of refusing loans, "it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our annual celebration of horticultural excellence." It was at this moment, as Mr. Henderson was warming to his theme of community spirit and the virtues of healthy competition, that the lights in the market hall performed their first curious trick of the evening. They dimmed, flickered, and then blazed forth with renewed vigor, causing several ladies to blink and adjust their spectacles. The borough electrician, Mr. Trimble, who was lurking near the entrance with the guilty air of a man whose equipment might be about to embarrass him publicly, made a note in his pocketbook and muttered something about new regulations from the council. The second curious event occurred during the brief confusion that followed the lighting incident. Mrs. Pettigrew, who prided herself on her powers of observation, later swore that she had seen a figure in a dark coat move swiftly along the side of the hall, pausing near the prize table before melting back into the crowd. Several other witnesses claimed to have noticed something similar, though their descriptions varied considerably as to height, build, and general appearance. Mr. Henderson, having weathered the interruption with the stoicism of a man accustomed to the vagaries of municipal electricity, continued his address. He spoke of tradition, of excellence, of the importance of maintaining standards in an age of declining values. His words fell upon the assembled company like a gentle shower upon well-tended soil, nourishing without exciting. It was only when he turned to announce the evening's prize winners that the third, and most significant, curiosity revealed itself. "The first prize for vegetables," he declared, consulting his notes with ceremonial precision, "goes to Mr. Arthur Penhaligon for his magnificent cucumber, a specimen that truly exemplifies the finest traditions of English horticulture." He gestured toward the prize table, where Mr. Penhaligon's cucumber had held pride of place throughout the evening. The gesture hung in the air like a question mark, for the simple reason that the cucumber was no longer there. In its place lay a small white envelope, sealed and unmarked save for a single word written in careful capitals. Midnight. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of appreciation, but the sharp, brittle silence of collective bewilderment. Mrs. Collop's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, like a fish that had suddenly found itself in unfamiliar waters. Mr. Penhaligon stared at the empty space where his prize had been, with the expression of a man who had just witnessed the laws of physics being casually violated. "I say," said Mr. Crask, who had never been one to let a dramatic moment pass without comment. "That's rather extraordinary." Inspector Purbright, who had been observing the proceedings with the quiet attention he brought to all social gatherings, now found himself moving almost imperceptibly closer to the prize table. He noted the way the envelope had been placed with mathematical precision in the exact center of the baize cloth. The fact that no one seemed to have witnessed the substitution despite the crowded hall, and the curious circumstance that whoever had removed the cucumber had taken considerable care not to disturb the surrounding displays. "Has anyone," he inquired mildly, "seen Mr. Penhaligon's cucumber recently?" This question, delivered in the sort of tone one might use to inquire about the weather, had the effect of releasing the assembled company from their collective paralysis. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, offering theories, suspicions, and observations with the enthusiasm of amateur detectives who had suddenly found themselves with a genuine mystery to solve. Mrs. Higgins suggested that it might be a practical joke, though her tone suggested she found such frivolity deeply inappropriate. Young Timothy Baxter wondered aloud if the cucumber might have been stolen by someone who intended to enter it in another show, a theory that caused several exhibitors to cast suspicious glances at their neighbors. Mr. Holroyd, with the sort of measured consideration that came naturally to his profession, observed that the theft had been carried out with considerable skill and planning. "The envelope," said Mrs. Collop, who had recovered her composure with admirable speed, "should surely be opened." "It may contain an explanation." All eyes turned to Inspector Purbright, who had somehow acquired the envelope without anyone noticing quite how or when. He held it delicately, as if it were a piece of evidence in a case of considerable importance, which, in the context of the Flaxborough Horticultural Show, it undoubtedly was. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a brief message typed on what appeared to be an old machine with a slightly crooked E. "The prize cucumber will be returned at midnight. No questions will be asked if certain irregularities in the judging are forgotten." The message was unsigned, but it carried with it the unmistakable whiff of scandal. Inspector Purbright folded the paper carefully and returned it to the envelope, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Well," he said in the same mild tone he had used before, "it appears we have a mystery." The market hall clock, as if responding to some cosmic sense of timing, began to strike 9. As the chimes echoed through the hall, a second, older bell, the one in the abandoned fire station across the square, began to ring in sympathy. It tolled 9 times, paused, and then, with what sounded almost like mechanical mischief, struck once more. 10 chimes. An irregularity that several people noticed, but no one quite knew how to interpret. Inspector Purbright stood quietly among the prize vegetables and the chattering townspeople, his mind already beginning to arrange the various elements of what promised to be a most interesting evening. Somewhere in Flaxborough, a person had planned something that was both audacious and oddly considerate. After all, they had promised to return the cucumber. The question was not merely who had taken it, but why they felt compelled to do so in such a theatrical manner. And why, he wondered as he glanced again at the envelope, had they chosen midnight as their moment of revelation? The evening, it seemed, was only just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the cucumber's disappearance possessed that peculiar quality common to all social disasters. Everyone spoke at once while pretending to maintain their composure. The market hall, which moments before had hummed with the comfortable murmur of municipal pride, now buzzed with the altogether more energetic sound of scandal being born. Mrs. Collop, whose natural authority in horticultural matters extended seamlessly to crisis management, appointed herself chief investigator with the sort of brisk efficiency that brooked no opposition. She began questioning witnesses with the thoroughness of a barrister, though with considerably less regard for the niceties of evidence. "Now then, Mrs. Pettigrew," she announced, fixing that lady with a gaze that had withered stronger souls than a mere grower of sweet peas. "You mentioned seeing a figure in a dark coat." "Tall, you said." "Well, yes," Mrs. Pettigrew replied, then immediately began to qualify her certainty in the manner of someone who had suddenly realized that being a witness was rather more complicated than being a spectator. "That is to say, tallish. Or perhaps it was the shadows. The lighting did play such tricks, didn't it?" Mr. Henderson, meanwhile, attempted to restore order by suggesting they continue with the remaining prize presentations, a proposal that met with the sort of polite resistance usually reserved for suggestions that one might enjoy a bracing walk in a thunderstorm. The idea of proceeding as if nothing had happened struck the assembled company as not merely inappropriate, but almost sacrilegious. "But surely," protested Miss Trent, the retired head mistress whose habit of precision had survived her departure from the classroom, "we cannot simply ignore this violation of horticultural protocol." Mr. Penhaligon's cucumber was the finest specimen any of us had seen in years. Mr. Penhaligon himself seemed caught between outrage and a curious sort of pride. The theft of his cucumber was, after all, a form of recognition. One did not, he reasoned, steal inferior vegetables. Still, the violation of everything he held sacred struck him as deeply unsporting. 18 years, he announced to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated expertise. 18 years I've been perfecting my cultivation methods, and some blackguard simply walks off with the result as if it were a common garden cucumber from the greengrocer's. Inspector Purbright, who had positioned himself near the prize table with the casual air of someone admiring the floral arrangements, found himself studying the assembled faces with the sort of mild interest he might have shown toward an unusual cloud formation. Each person's reaction told its own small story, and he filed away these observations with the methodical care of a librarian cataloguing books. Mrs. Higgins kept glancing toward her preserve display as if expecting it to vanish next, her hands fluttering protectively near her prize-winning marmalade. Young Timothy Baxter appeared more excited than distressed, clearly viewing the theft as the most interesting development in the history of horticultural shows. Mr. Crask had positioned himself strategically near his gladioli, though whether from protective instinct or territorial assertion remained unclear. More intriguing to the inspector were those who seemed least affected by the drama. Mr. Holroyd continued his methodical examination of the various exhibits, making occasional notes in a small leather book with the detached interest of a professional observer. Dr. Meadows, who had arrived fashionably late and seemed genuinely unaware of the excitement, was studying the vegetable displays with what appeared to be clinical curiosity, his medical bag resting at his feet like a faithful dog. The borough electrician, Mr. Trimble, had materialized near the prize table with the shuffling, purposeful gait of a man determined to ensure that no blame for anything would attach itself to his electrical installations. "Nothing wrong with the wiring," he announced to no one in particular, though his tone suggested he was prepared to defend this position against all comers. "New transformer, council-approved bulbs, everything up to regulation. That dimming was perfectly normal. Happens when someone turns on the tea-urn too quick." "And the bell?" Purbright inquired mildly, as if asking about the weather. Mr. Trimble scratched his neck with the air of a man confronting a mystery that offended his professional sensibilities. "Now that's odd, I'll grant you. Old fire station bells shouldn't be connected to anything. Hasn't been for years. There's a rope, or was, till the boys made off with it for their games. So if it chimed along with the hall clock—" He paused, clearly reluctant to venture into territory that might involve the supernatural. "Most curious," Purbright observed, filing away this information with the same care he had shown the envelope. The suggestion of searching the premises came from Mrs. Collop, delivered with the sort of decisive authority that had once organized church fetes and now seemed perfectly suited to criminal investigation. The proposal had obvious merit, though Inspector Purbright suspected that any thief clever enough to remove a prize cucumber from under the collective nose of Flaxborough's horticultural elite was unlikely to be found wandering the market hall with the evidence tucked under their arm. The search that followed was conducted with methodical thoroughness. Mrs. Collop organized the ladies into search parties, each assigned to a specific area of the hall. The gentlemen, under Mr. Henderson's increasingly frazzled direction, examined the more obvious hiding places, behind stage curtains, beneath trestle tables, inside the various cupboards that lined the walls like silent witnesses to decades of municipal events. Inspector Purbright used the opportunity to conduct his own, more subtle investigation. He noted that Mr. Crask's hands showed recent traces of soil, though this might be explained by last-minute adjustments to his gladioli display. Dr. Meadows's medical bag seemed unusually bulky, though again, this might be perfectly innocent. More interesting was his discovery that the hall's rear exit, normally kept locked during events, showed signs of recent use. The bolt had been drawn back, and there were fresh scuff marks on the threshold. The most reliable witness proved to be Miss Trent, whose habit of arriving early to all social functions was matched only by her tendency to notice everything that occurred within her considerable field of vision. She announced with a precision that had once terrorized generations of school children, last observed the cucumber at 23 minutes past 8, when she had paused to admire its remarkable straightness. "And when did you next look at the prize table?" Purbright asked. I didn't specifically look again until Mr. Henderson called for attention, Miss Trent replied with characteristic honesty. I was engaged in conversation with Dr. Meadows about the peculiar behavior of the electrical system. Most irregular, those flickering lights. This narrowed the window of opportunity to approximately 25 minutes. A brief period during which someone had managed to remove an 18-inch cucumber without being observed by a hall full of people whose primary occupation was observing things. As the search proceeded without success, the assembled company began to divide into conversational groups, each developing its own theory about the crime. Near the tea table, Mrs. Pettigrew was sharing her observations with anyone who would listen. I distinctly saw someone, tall, in a dark coat, step up to the table during that first flicker, she insisted, though her certainty seemed to diminish with each retelling. They were on the left side of the table, or possibly the right. Well, certainly one of the sides. The name of Mr. Septimus Grubb began to circulate with increasing frequency. Grubb, who owned the town's smaller, less prosperous hardware store, was known to harbor considerable resentment toward Mr. Penhaligon's success, both in business and horticulture. His conspicuous absence from the evening's festivities had not gone unnoticed, particularly by those who remembered his bitter complaints about rigged judging following last year's show. Always had a chip on his shoulder, that one, observed Mr. Trotter, the butcher, to his wife. And where is he tonight, I ask you? Convenient that he's not here to defend himself. He's probably at home sulking, Mrs. Trotter replied with practical wisdom. He always sulks after the show. Besides, what would he want with a cucumber? Revenge, my dear, her husband replied with dramatic emphasis. Pure, unadulterated revenge. Inspector Purbright allowed these various theories to wash over him like gentle rain on well-tended soil. He knew that in Flaxborough, truth was rarely a simple matter, but rather a complex tapestry woven from perceptions, prejudices, and half-remembered slights. The missing cucumber was not merely a stolen vegetable. It was a symbol, a challenge to the established order, a public airing of private grievances. The note, with its pointed reference to irregularities in the judging, was particularly intriguing. It suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the show's operations, someone who felt wronged by the current system, someone with both the audacity to commit theft and the restraint to promise return. As the official search concluded without success and the crowd began to thin, Inspector Purbright noticed that several people seemed reluctant to depart. Mrs. Collop lingered near the prize table, clearly hoping to witness the promised midnight return. Mr. Penhaligon hovered nearby, torn between curiosity and the desperate desire to reclaim his stolen property. Even some of the earlier departures seemed to be taking unusually circuitous routes home, as if they too were curious about what midnight might bring. The market hall clock showed 10:30 as the last of the official attendees made their farewells. The committee members departed with the sort of strained politeness that follows social disasters, each privately wondering how this would affect their reputations. The prize table stood abandoned, save for its remaining exhibits, the empty space where the cucumber had rested as conspicuous as a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Inspector Purbright remained behind, ostensibly to ensure the hall was properly secured, but actually to prepare for what promised to be an interesting midnight appointment. He arranged for Sergeant Love to position himself discreetly within the hall, for Constable Ablewaite to watch the rear entrance, and for W.P.C. Dunn to observe from the shadows near the main door. As 11 o'clock approached, Flaxborough settled into the sort of expectant quiet that precedes significant events. In parlors throughout the town, people who had attended the show were recounting the evening's drama to those who had missed it, each telling growing more elaborate with repetition. The mystery of the missing cucumber had already begun its transformation from simple theft to local legend. The market hall stood silent in the square, its windows reflecting the streetlights like watchful eyes. Inside, Inspector Purbright waited with the patient attention he brought to all puzzles, knowing that midnight would bring either answers or deeper questions. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward the appointed hour, while somewhere in the darkness, someone prepared to keep their curious promise. The evening's real drama, he suspected, was yet to begin. The approach of midnight in Flaxborough carried with it the particular stillness that settles over market towns when honest citizens have retired to their beds and only the curious remain abroad. The market hall, which hours earlier had buzzed with scandal and speculation, now possessed the expectant quality of a theatre moments before the curtain rises. Inspector Purbright stood in the shadows near the memorial plaque, a position that afforded him an excellent view of both the prize table and the main entrance. His breathing was so carefully controlled that he might have been mistaken for one of the more contemplative exhibits. Sergeant Love had positioned himself behind Mrs. Higgins's preserved display with the sort of professional invisibility that comes from years of patient observation, while Constable Ablewhite maintained his vigil at the rear entrance, his considerable bulk somehow rendered inconspicuous by sheer determination. The town clock began. Its measured approach to the appointed hour, each quarter chime echoing through the hall with ceremonial precision. At 11:55, Inspector Purbright became aware of a subtle change in the building's atmosphere. Not a sound, precisely, but rather the sort of disturbance one feels when the natural order of things is about to be altered. A faint creaking came from somewhere above, the sort of sound old buildings make when subjected to unusual stress. It was followed by an almost inaudible whisper of rope against wood, and then a gentle thud that seemed to emanate from the prize table itself. The town clock struck midnight with its customary dignity, each chime resonating through the hall. As the 12th stroke faded into silence, Inspector Purbright moved toward the prize table with the unhurried gait of a man who had expected exactly what he found there. Mr. Penhaligon's cucumber lay upon its bed of green baize with the same regal composure it had displayed earlier in the evening. Its 18 inches of perfection showed no signs of having been anywhere other than its appointed place of honor, save for the addition of a small white envelope tied to its middle with a piece of garden twine. Sergeant Love emerged from his concealment among the preserves, his expression combining professional satisfaction with genuine curiosity. "Well, I'll be hanged," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles. The blighter actually kept his word. Inspector Purbright examined the cucumber without touching it, noting the careful precision with which it had been placed and the quality of the twine used to secure the envelope. "Indeed, Sergeant. Though I suspect this is merely the opening movement of a rather more complex composition." The envelope contained a second message, typed on the same machine with its characteristic crooked E. "The cucumber is returned as promised." But the irregularities in last year's judging remain unaddressed. Mr. Henderson's partiality toward certain exhibitors was noted by many, but mentioned by none. Consider this a final warning before more detailed revelations become necessary. A concerned citizen of Flaxborough. The discovery of the mechanism that had accomplished this theatrical return required a visit to the hall's upper regions, where the committee rooms and storage areas normally lay undisturbed. A simple but ingenious pulley system had been rigged between the rafters, operated by a cord that passed through a carefully bored hole in the wall and connected to the old fire station's bell mechanism. When the town clock struck midnight, the sympathetic vibration had released a catch, allowing the cucumber to descend from its temporary hiding place with the gentle precision of a stage effect. The apparatus showed signs of careful preparation and testing. The rope bore traces of beeswax, applied to prevent squeaking, and the pulleys themselves had been oiled with the sort of attention to detail that suggested either professional experience or considerable forethought. Most significantly, the entire mechanism could be assembled and dismantled using tools available at any well-stocked hardware store. By morning, the return of the cucumber had become the sole topic of conversation in Flaxborough. The news traveled through the town's intricate network of hairdressing salons, post office queues, and grocery shop encounters with the speed and efficiency that only genuine scandal can achieve. Inspector Purbright began his formal inquiries at Mr. Penhaligon's residence, where the recovered cucumber had been restored to a place of honor on the kitchen table. Mr. Penhaligon himself seemed caught between relief at his vegetable's safe return and indignation at the aspersions cast upon the judging process. "Irregularities in the judging," he boomed, his voice carrying the weight of wounded pride. "My cucumber, Inspector, was judged on merit alone. 18 inches of perfection, cultivated through years of dedicated effort and scientific precision. If anyone suggests otherwise, they're either ignorant or malicious." The note mentions Mr. Henderson specifically, Purbright observed mildly. "Have you noticed any particular friendship between yourself and the show's chairman?" Mr. Penhaligon's face reddened slightly. "Henderson's a fair man, always has been. If he's shown appreciation for quality when he sees it, that's merely good judgment, not favoritism. Though I'll grant you, there are those in this town who mistake excellence for conspiracy." Mrs. Collop, interviewed in her drawing room amid the scent of roses and the weight of accumulated authority, proved more forthcoming about the town's horticultural politics. The accusation about Mr. Henderson is not entirely without foundation, she admitted, stirring her tea with the measured movements of someone choosing their words carefully. "He and Mr. Penhaligon have been friends for years, business associates, in fact. Henderson's bank holds the mortgage on Penhaligon's new shop. One might argue that such relationships should preclude judging, though of course nothing was ever said officially. And who might feel strongly enough about such arrangements to stage last night's performance?" Purbright inquired. "Mr. Grubb, obviously. He's nursed grievances about the judging for years, but there are others. Young Timothy Baxter, whose father was quite the vegetable grower before his illness. Mr. Crask, who fancied himself a serious competitor this year. Even Dr. Meadows has expressed opinions about the need for more scientific judging criteria." The visit to Grubb's Hardware revealed a man whose bitterness had been refined by years of perceived injustice. Septimus Grubb, his thin mustache twitching with nervous energy, seemed almost relieved to have an opportunity to voice his complaints. "Rigged, the whole thing's been rigged for years," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated resentment. "Henderson and Penhaligon, thick as thieves they are. You think it's coincidence that Penhaligon wins year after year, with his secret mixtures and his scientific methods? It's not natural, I tell you. And where were you last evening, Mr. Epton? Grubb, between 8 o'clock and midnight?" Grubb's eyes darted about his cluttered shop. "Here, of course. Reading. A book on proper organic cultivation. The sort Penhaligon wouldn't understand if it bit him. I don't attend those farces anymore. Too depressing to watch honest effort lose to chemical trickery." Inspector Purbright noted that Grubb's hands bore traces of soil and rope fibers, though this might be explained by his profession. More interesting was the faint scent of beeswax that seemed to cling to the man's clothing. Mr. Crask, interviewed in his jewelry shop, maintained his usual air of refined detachment while offering observations that were both acute and carefully neutral. "The whole affair was quite extraordinary, Inspector," he said, polishing a silver locket with mechanical precision. "One doesn't often see such theatrical flair in Flaxborough. Though I must say, if someone wished to make a point about the judging, they could hardly have chosen a more effective method. Did you notice anything unusual at the show, beyond the obvious disappearance? Well, there's always tension at these events. Grubb looked particularly sour, even by his standards. And young Baxter seemed rather put out when his carrots received no recognition. But then, disappointment is rather the norm at these competitions, isn't it? Only one person can win each category." As the day progressed, Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the curious psychology of the crime. The theft and return had been accomplished with considerable skill and theatrical flair, but the motive seemed rooted less in malice than in a desire for justice, or at least what the perpetrator considered justice. The mechanical ingenuity displayed suggested someone with practical skills and access to appropriate materials. The timing and theatrical elements indicated a person with both patience and a flair for the dramatic. Most significantly, the promise to return the cucumber had been kept precisely, suggesting someone whose word, once given, could be trusted. The references to judging irregularities opened a more complex question. If there had indeed been favoritism in the competition, it represented a violation of the principles that made such events meaningful to their participants. In a town like Flaxborough, where reputation and social standing were carefully maintained through such public displays of excellence, any corruption of the judging process would constitute a serious offense against the community's values. As evening approached, Inspector Purbright sat in his office reviewing the day's interviews and evidence. The cucumber case was developing into something far more complex than simple theft. It was becoming an investigation into the very nature of fairness and competition in a small English town. The mechanical evidence pointed to someone with practical skills and careful planning. The social evidence suggested multiple individuals with plausible motives. The theatrical elements indicated a person who understood both drama and psychology. Most intriguingly, the promise of more detailed revelations suggested that the cucumber's return was merely the opening gambit in a larger campaign. Someone in Flaxborough had decided that the time had come to air grievances that had been festering for years, and they had chosen to do so with a combination of audacity and precision that was both admirable and deeply unsettling. The question was no longer simply who had taken the cucumber, but who felt compelled to challenge the established order of Flaxborough's most cherished institution, and what revelations they might be prepared to make if their warning went unheeded. The cucumber, safely returned to its rightful place, had served its purpose as a symbol. But the real mystery, the question of justice, fairness, and the complex web of relationships that governed life in Flaxborough, was only beginning to unfold. Morning brought a clink of milk bottles and a rustle of newspapers, and with them the impression that the entire town had been personally affronted. The Flaxborough Advertiser, which could ordinarily be relied upon to inflate even minor incidents to civic significance, outdid itself with the headline, "Vegetable Vandal Strikes at Show." Beneath, the editor, Mr. Winch, who had the air of a man whose spectacles were permanently astonished by humanity, permitted himself a paragraph of moral concern before settling into the contented exercise of listing all persons known to have been in the vicinity of the prize table at relevant moments. Inspector Purbright read the piece over his toast, as a general might examine enemy dispositions on a map. He noted the sequence of detail and the rich seam of insinuation that would sustain coffee shop conversation until at least Thursday. More significantly, he observed that the letters to the editor contained a spirited communication from an underwater gardener, rebuking artificial assistance in cucumber cultivation and proposing blind judging in future. The rhetoric had a youthful impatience about it and an oddly precise punctuation that suggested familiarity with formal correspondence. By 10 o'clock, the collective wisdom of Flaxborough had settled upon Septimus Grubb with the comfortable certainty that accompanies all satisfactory explanations. Sergeant Love, whose approach to detection favored the direct route over scenic diversions, had already arranged the evidence in neat piles upon his desk like a shopkeeper displaying his most reliable goods. "It's grub, isn't it, sir?" he announced with the confidence of a man who had solved mysteries by the simple expedient of accepting their most obvious solutions. "Should I die?" Grudge against Penhaligon, his absence from the show, years of complaints about rigged judging, and the hardware angle, pulleys, twine, beeswax. Everything points to a man who runs a hardware establishment and nurses professional grievances. Mr. Henderson arrived shortly thereafter, his banker's composure somewhat frayed at the edges like a well-worn banknote. "Inspector, this grub individual must be made an example of. The reputation of the Horticultural Show cannot survive such theatrical insolence. The man has clearly overstepped every boundary of civilized competition." Purbright allowed these certainties to wash over him like gentle rain on well-tended soil. "Indeed," he murmured, examining the recovered notes with the sort of mild interest he might show toward an unusual cloud formation. "Though I confess, the theatrical element puzzles me slightly. Mr. Grubb strikes me as a man more inclined toward direct complaint than elaborate stage management." The morning's inquiries began with a visit to the abandoned fire station where the borough surveyor, Mr. Croom, met them with a ring of keys and the wounded air of a man whose buildings had been made part of an elaborate joke. The mechanism that had accomplished the cucumber's return proved to be both ingenious and remarkably simple. A pulley system operated by the sympathetic vibration of the old bell when the town clock struck midnight. "French chalk on the grooves," Purbright observed, running his finger along the worn metal, "and beeswax on the rope. Someone took considerable trouble over silence." He paused at a short length of garden twine caught on a splinter. The knot was a clove hitch, properly finished, the sort of work that spoke of either professional experience or careful instruction. "Scouts use that knot," Sergeant Love offered helpfully. "Sea Scouts particularly. Young Baxter's in that group, isn't he?" The visit to the Market Hall office revealed Miss Lyle, the committee secretary, presiding over an ancient typewriter with the dignity of a ship's captain at her wheel. When Purbright requested a sample of the machine's output, she obligingly typed a brief sentence. The E drooped with familiar courtesy, bowing slightly below the line as if acknowledging its mechanical infirmity. "The machine is shared," Miss Lyle explained with the precision that had once made her invaluable to 3 successive committee chairmen. "Mr. Henderson has a key to the office, as does Mrs. Collop. Mr. Trimble requires access for electrical maintenance. Even the Sea Scouts borrow the hall occasionally for their meetings when the riverside hut proves inadequate." The afternoon brought a series of interviews that revealed the complex web of relationships underlying Flaxborough's horticultural politics. Dr. Meadows, encountered in his surgery amid the ordered chaos of medical practice, proved unexpectedly knowledgeable about mechanical principles. "Fascinating case, Inspector," he said, examining photographs of the pulley system with professional interest. "The precision required suggests someone with considerable understanding of timing and measurement. Not necessarily medical knowledge, but certainly the sort of skills one develops in any profession requiring exact procedures." Young Timothy Baxter, interviewed at the Sea Scout hut where the scent of rope and canvas spoke of practical education, demonstrated his knot-tying abilities with the unconscious competence of long practice. His enthusiasm for the technical aspects of the crime seemed genuine, though tempered by a curious defensiveness when questioned about his whereabouts during the crucial evening hours. "It was brilliant, really," he admitted, his eyes bright with admiration. "The timing, the precision. You'd need to understand the hall's construction perfectly. Though I suppose Mr. Grubb knows about pulleys and such, being in hardware." Mr. Krask, encountered in his jewelry shop amid the quiet gleam of precious metals, offered observations delivered with the measured precision of his professional work. "The perpetrator clearly possesses an appreciation for detail, Inspector. The careful placement of the cucumber, the choice of midnight, it suggests a mind that values the finer points of execution over mere vandalism." As the day progressed, Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the curious psychology of the crime. The evidence against Grubb was certainly compelling. Motive, means, and opportunity aligned with satisfying neatness. Yet something in the theatrical precision of the act suggested a mind more subtle than that of a simple malcontent nursing professional grievances. The anonymous notes spoke of irregularities in the judging and referenced Henderson's partiality with the sort of specific knowledge that suggested intimate familiarity with the show's operations. More intriguingly, they implied a collective awareness, noted by many but mentioned by none, that transcended individual resentment. Mrs. Collop, consulted in her rose-scented drawing room, proved characteristically forthright about the town's horticultural undercurrents. The accusation about Mr. Henderson is not entirely without foundation, she admitted with the careful honesty of someone who valued truth above comfort. His friendship with Mr. Penhaligon has been remarked upon. Business associates, you understand. The bank holds mortgages on Penhaligon's properties. One might argue such relationships should preclude judging, though nothing was ever said officially. The day's final discovery came from an unexpected source. Miss Lyle, arriving at the police station as evening approached, bore news that cast the investigation in an entirely new light. The committee's record book, containing the detailed scoring sheets from previous year's competitions, had vanished from the hall office. "I noticed it this afternoon when tidying the files," she explained, her usual composure, disturbed by this violation of proper order. "The green ledger, where we keep all the judges' tallies and notes. It was there yesterday morning when I prepared for the show, but now—" She gestured helplessly. Purbright received this information with the quiet attention he brought to all significant developments. The theft of the cucumber had been theatrical, designed to draw attention. The disappearance of the record book suggested something altogether more serious, the concealment or destruction of evidence that might support the anonymous accusations. As darkness settled over Flaxborough, Inspector Purbright sat in his office contemplating the day's revelations. The case against Grubb remained superficially convincing, but the missing ledger introduced complications that transcended simple rivalry. Someone in the town possessed not merely the technical skills to orchestrate elaborate theft, but access to official records and detailed knowledge of the committee's operations. The promise of more detailed revelations took on new significance in light of the ledger's disappearance. If the scoring sheets contained evidence of the alleged irregularities, their theft suggested someone was prepared to move beyond theatrical gestures toward more direct action. The cucumber had served its purpose as symbol and warning. But the real mystery, the question of justice, fairness, and the complex web of relationships that governed civic life in Flaxborough, was revealing itself to be far more intricate than a simple tale of horticultural rivalry. Outside his window, the market hall stood silent in the square, its windows reflecting the streetlights like watchful eyes. Somewhere in the town, someone who understood both the mechanics of pulleys and the psychology of public opinion was preparing their next move. The question was no longer simply who had taken the cucumber, but what they intended to reveal about the carefully maintained facade of Flaxborough's most cherished institution, and whether Inspector Purbright could untangle the truth before the delicate balance of civic respectability suffered irreparable damage. The morning brought with it the particular satisfaction that accompanies the discovery of connections previously hidden beneath the surface of ordinary events. Inspector Purbright found himself examining the previous day's edition of the Flaxborough Advertiser with the sort of methodical attention he might have devoted to a suspect's alibi, noting not merely what had been printed, but what editorial choices had been made in the printing. The letter from Underwater Gardener occupied a position of prominence that suggested Mr. Winch, the editor, had recognized its potential to generate the sort of civic discussion that sold newspapers. The prose style was brisk and confident, employing the kind of precise punctuation that spoke of education carefully remembered rather than casually acquired. A visit to the newspaper office revealed Mr. Winch in his natural habitat, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of deadlines and civic indignation. He received Inspector Purbright with the cautious courtesy accorded to those who might provide either news or trouble, and frequently both. The letter arrived with the first post, Mr. Winch explained, producing the original envelope with the care of a curator handling a manuscript. No return address, naturally. Typed on what appears to be an institutional machine. Note the characteristic droop of the E and the slightly uneven spacing. Purbright examined the envelope without touching it, noting the postmark's timing and the quality of the paper. The watermark, barely visible, showed the faint outline of what might have been a lion rampant, the sort of detail that suggested either institutional stationery or someone with particular ideas about appropriate correspondence materials. "The phrasing strikes me as rather academic," he observed mildly. "Hydroponics, blind judging, not the usual vocabulary of gardening enthusiasts." "Quite so," Mr. Winch agreed, "though I've noticed that righteous indignation often elevates one's vocabulary. Nothing like a good grievance to bring out the semicolons." The typewriter in the Market Hall office, when Purbright examined it later that morning, displayed the same characteristic flaw in its E, a mechanical infirmity that connected the anonymous notes, the newspaper letter, and the missing committee ledger in a chain of evidence that was both circumstantial and compelling. Miss Lyle discovered arranging files with the methodical precision that had made her invaluable to 3 successive committee chairmen, confirmed that access to the machine was neither restricted nor recorded. "Anyone with a key to the office might use it," she explained, her tone suggesting that such casual arrangements belonged to a more trusting age. "Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Collop, Mr. Trimble for his electrical work. The Sea Scouts have borrowed the hall on occasion, and their leader would naturally require access to facilities." The afternoon brought an emergency meeting of the Horticultural Show Committee, convened with a sort of grave formality normally reserved for matters of constitutional importance. The Market Hall, scene of the previous evening's drama, now hosted a gathering whose members seemed acutely aware that their reputations hung in the balance. Mrs. Collop presided with her customary authority, though Purbright detected a certain brittleness in her composure that suggested the strain of maintaining dignity under siege. Mr. Henderson attempted to project the sort of calm competence that had served him well in banking, though his frequent adjustments to his spectacles betrayed an underlying anxiety. "The theft of our records," Mrs. Collop announced, "represents an attack upon the very foundations of fair competition." The ledger contained not merely scores, but the detailed observations and discussions that inform our judging process. Its loss compromises our ability to defend our decisions. Mr. Crask, whose jeweler's precision extended to his choice of words, observed that the timing of the ledger's disappearance suggested deliberate planning rather than opportunistic theft. "One might almost say," he added with characteristic delicacy, "that someone wished to prevent examination of past decisions." Dr. Meadows, who had arrived carrying his medical bag with the sort of casual authority that marked him as a man accustomed to being summoned to urgent situations, offered a perspective that struck several members as unexpectedly astute. "If irregularities exist," he said, his tone carrying the clinical detachment of professional diagnosis, "their concealment serves no one's interests. Better to address concerns openly than allow speculation to flourish in darkness." Purbright's examination of the Hall office revealed details that spoke of careful preparation and execution. The chair positioned beneath the ledger's shelf bore traces of recent use, not merely dust-disturbed, but the faint residue of something that had been deliberately applied to ensure silence. A small fragment of what appeared to be green glass, no larger than a pinhead, caught his attention near the filing cabinet. Under magnification, it proved to be a piece of horticultural grit, the sort used in specialized potting mixtures to improve drainage. This particular specimen possessed an unusual iridescent quality that suggested commercial rather than domestic origin. The discovery connected to his earlier observations of the various suspects. Mr. Penhaligon's boasts about his secret mixtures took on new significance when considered alongside the sophisticated nature of the cucumber theft. Dr. Meadows's professional interest in scientific judging criteria seemed less casual when viewed in light of the methodical approach to evidence gathering. As the day progressed, Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the curious psychology revealed by the case. The perpetrator possessed not merely technical skills and access to facilities, but a particular mindset that valued precision and thoroughness above dramatic gesture. The theatrical return of the cucumber had served its purpose as symbol and warning, but the theft of the ledger suggested someone with deeper concerns about institutional integrity. The combination of public protest and private investigation spoke of a mind that understood both the power of symbolism and the necessity of evidence. The anonymous correspondence revealed someone with education and access to quality materials, while the mechanical aspects of the crime demonstrated practical competence and careful planning. Most significantly, the promise of more detailed revelations suggested that the cucumber affair was merely the opening movement in a larger campaign for what the perpetrator considered justice. The evening brought an unexpected encounter with Dr. Meadows outside the market hall, where he appeared to be conducting his own examination of the scene. His medical bag, Purbright noted, seemed unusually bulky for a casual evening stroll, and the doctor's manner suggested someone with particular interest in the physical evidence. "Curious case, Inspector," Meadows observed, his tone carrying the sort of professional interest that might be applied to an unusual medical condition. The precision required suggests someone with considerable understanding of both mechanical principles and human psychology. "Indeed," Purbright replied, noting the faint scent of something antiseptic that clung to the doctor's clothing, "though I find myself wondering whether the motive is justice or revenge." "Perhaps," Meadows suggested with a slight smile, "the distinction is less clear than we might suppose. After all, one person's justice is often another's revenge, particularly in matters involving reputation and fair play." By evening, the cucumber affair had evolved from simple theft to complex investigation of civic propriety. The missing ledger had transformed what might have been dismissed as elaborate prank into serious inquiry about institutional integrity. Conversations in the town's various establishments revealed the sort of divided loyalties that characterize communities where personal relationships intersect with public responsibilities. Mr. Penhaligon's supporters emphasized his years of contribution to the town's prosperity, while his critics pointed to the suspicious timing of his recent successes. The anonymous accusations of judging irregularities had struck at the heart of what made competition meaningful to the participants. If favoritism had indeed influenced past decisions, it represented not merely rule-breaking but betrayal of the trust that made such events possible. As Inspector Purbright prepared for another evening of observation, he reflected on the curious nature of the case. The cucumber had been returned as promised, but the real mystery, the question of justice, fairness, and institutional integrity, remained unresolved. The missing ledger represented either evidence of wrongdoing or an attempt to prevent embarrassment. The sophisticated nature of the investigation suggested someone with both resources and determination to pursue truth regardless of social consequences. Most intriguingly, the perpetrator had demonstrated remarkable restraint in their revelations. The chemical analysis hinted at but not detailed, the specific accusations made but not elaborated, the promise of further disclosures held in reserve, all suggested someone who understood the power of graduated pressure. The question was no longer simply who had orchestrated the cucumber's theatrical disappearance, but who possessed both the moral conviction and practical resources to challenge Flaxborough's carefully maintained social order, and what they intended to reveal next in their methodical campaign for what they considered justice. The town settled into evening with the sort of expectant quiet that follows significant events. Behind curtains throughout Flaxborough, people who had attended the show were reconsidering not merely the evening's drama, but their understanding of the institutions they had long taken for granted. The cucumber case had become something far more complex than horticultural rivalry. It had become an investigation into the very nature of fairness and integrity in a community where reputation and achievement were carefully maintained through public displays of excellence. And somewhere in the darkness, someone who valued precision above popularity was preparing their next move in what promised to be a most methodical revelation of uncomfortable truths. The morning brought with it the particular satisfaction that accompanies the discovery of connections previously hidden beneath the surface of ordinary events. Inspector Purbright found himself examining a small fragment of what appeared to be green glass, no larger than a pinhead, which had been discovered near the filing cabinet in the Market Hall office. Under magnification, it proved to be a piece of horticultural grit, the sort used in specialized potting mixtures to improve drainage. This particular specimen possessed an unusual iridescent quality that suggested commercial rather than domestic origin. The discovery connected to his earlier observations in ways that were both intriguing and troubling. The sophisticated nature of the cucumber theft, combined with the methodical disappearance of the committee ledger, suggested someone with not merely technical skills, but access to specialized materials and detailed knowledge of horticultural science. A visit to the Market Hall's committee room revealed what proved to be the morning's most significant discovery. Behind the velvet curtain that concealed the sort of municipal flattery that passes for history, hung photographs of committee members engaged in the solemn business of judging excellence. The frames were identical, save for tiny details, as if the framer had taken a vow of institutional sameness. Purbright noted that 2 years ago, the judges had been Henderson, Mrs. Collop, and a Reverend Biggs. Last year's photograph showed Henderson, Mrs. Collop, and no Reverend Biggs, who had retired to coastal tranquility, replaced by Mr. Crask. The titles beneath had been typed separately on small slips with the precision that characterized all official documentation. In last year's frame, however, the slip for Assistant Adjudicator bore the ghost of another name beneath its pasted surface. When he teased a corner, gently for fear of becoming part of the vandalism he had come to observe, he glimpsed backwards through the paper a printed Penhal. The original slip had once read, Advisory, Mr. A. Penhaligon. It had been replaced with Mr. Crask's name. The implication was both subtle and damning. Mr. Penhaligon had once served in an advisory capacity to the judging committee, a position that would have been quietly abandoned when his own entries began winning with suspicious regularity. Someone had taken considerable care to obscure this historical connection, suggesting awareness that such arrangements might prove embarrassing if discovered. The afternoon brought a series of interviews that revealed the complex web of relationships and grievances underlying Flaxborough's horticultural politics. Timothy Baxter, encountered at the Sea Scout hut where the scent of rope and canvas spoke of practical education, proved unexpectedly articulate about both technical matters and family history. My father always said the judging needed to be more objective, Timothy explained, demonstrating a clove hitch with the practiced ease of long familiarity. He kept detailed records of his yields, his growing conditions. Said it was all scientific evidence. He tried hydroponics for a while. That's growing plants in water with mineral solutions instead of soil. Very modern, very precise. The mention of hydroponics resonated with the anonymous underwater gardener letter that had appeared in the Flaxborough Advertiser. The technical language, the sophisticated argument for blind judging, and the precise punctuation suggested a writer whose education was both formal and recently applied. Your father's records, Purbright inquired with casual interest, do they still exist? Timothy's eyes brightened with the sort of enthusiasm that comes from having one's interests acknowledged by authority. Oh, yes, sir. Boxes of them, charts, measurements, photographs of specimens. He always said that one day someone would want to see proof of proper scientific method versus other influences. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a carefully tended fire. Timothy Baxter Sr. had apparently maintained his own documentation of horticultural excellence, complete with the sort of detailed evidence that might support accusations of judging irregularities. The visit to Holroyd's funeral establishment revealed that gentleman in his natural environment of quiet dignity and professional discretion. His premises exuded the sort of calm authority that comes from dealing regularly with life's final certainties, though Purbright detected a certain animation when the conversation turned to matters horticultural. "My late brother Thomas was quite the enthusiast," Holroyd explained, his voice carrying the measured tones of professional sympathy. "Never won a major prize, despite considerable talents with dahlias. Always felt the judges overlooked his innovations in favor of more traditional displays." The undertaker gestured toward a glass-fronted bookcase filled with leather-bound volumes. Thomas kept meticulous records of every show he attended, every judge's comment, every perceived slight. He called it his Register of Injustice, a morbid turn of phrase perhaps, but Thomas had a dramatic flair. He used to say that one day the truth would out. Purbright examined the bookcase with a sort of mild interest that concealed considerable curiosity. The volumes were arranged with funeral precision, each spine bearing dates in Thomas Holroyd's careful script. If such records existed for multiple dissatisfied exhibitors, they would constitute a formidable archive of grievances and evidence. The morning's post brought developments that shifted the investigation in unexpected directions. A manila envelope had appeared overnight in the market hall's letter slot, addressed in the familiar typescript to the authorities or horticultural irregularities. The contents proved to be photocopies of judging sheets from the previous 3 years, complete with scores, comments, and signatures. More significantly, they included what appeared to be preliminary tallies in Mr. Henderson's handwriting, showing scores that differed substantially from the final recorded results. The discrepancies were subtle but consistent. Mr. Penhaligon's vegetables had received modest scores in initial judging, only to be elevated substantially in final tallies. Conversely, entries from Mr. Grubb and young Timothy Baxter showed the opposite pattern, promising preliminary scores that somehow diminished in final recording. The quality of the photocopies suggested access to professional equipment, the sort found in medical offices, legal practices, or educational institutions. The careful organization of the evidence spoke of someone with systematic habits and long-term planning. An evening interview with Dr. Meadows took place in his surgery, where the familiar sense of antiseptic and professional competence created an atmosphere of clinical detachment. The doctor's medical bag, resting on his desk like a faithful companion, showed signs of recent reorganization. Several compartments that would normally contain supplies appeared to have been recently emptied and cleaned with unusual thoroughness. The mechanical aspects of the crime are indeed impressive, Meadows acknowledged, his tone carrying professional appreciation for technical skill. The precision required, the understanding of timing and leverage, it suggests someone with considerable knowledge of practical physics. When Purbright mentioned the fragment of horticultural grit, the doctor's interest sharpened perceptibly. Iridescent quality, you say? That suggests vermiculite treated with mineral solutions, the sort used in advanced hydroponic cultivation, not common in ordinary gardening but essential for scientific growing methods. The connection to hydroponics strengthened the link between the physical evidence and the underwater gardener correspondence. Someone with access to specialized growing materials and knowledge of scientific cultivation methods was involved in the investigation's expanding complexity. As the day progressed, Inspector Purbright found himself mapping the intricate relationships that underlay Flaxborough's civic life. The Horticultural Show existed not merely as competition, but as annual reaffirmation of social hierarchies and community values. The anonymous revelations threatened not merely individual reputations, but the entire structure of trust upon which such institutions depended. The evidence suggested a collaboration rather than individual action. Multiple people with different skills and access, contributing to a coordinated campaign for what they considered justice. The shared typewriter, the widely known irregularities, the common desire for fairness. These threads could bind disparate individuals in common cause. As darkness settled over Flaxborough, Inspector Purbright contemplated the curious evolution of the case. What had begun as theatrical theft had developed into serious investigation of institutional integrity, revealing a web of relationships, grievances, and carefully maintained secrets that extended far beyond simple horticultural rivalry. The perpetrator, or perpetrators, possessed not merely technical skills and access to evidence, but sophisticated understanding of community dynamics and the delicate balance between justice and mercy. The graduated nature of the revelations suggested people who hoped to achieve reform rather than revenge, though the line between the two was proving increasingly difficult to distinguish. The cucumber had served its purpose as symbol and catalyst. Now the real work of justice, or perhaps something more complex than justice, was beginning in earnest. The question was no longer simply who had orchestrated the elaborate theft, but who possessed both the moral conviction and practical resources to sustain a methodical campaign against Flaxborough's carefully maintained social order, and what revelations they might be prepared to make if their warnings continued to go unheeded. The town settled into evening with a sort of expectant tension that precedes significant events. Behind curtains throughout Flaxborough, people who had long accepted the show's authority were reconsidering not merely past results, but their understanding of the institutions that governed community life. The delicate balance of civic respectability was beginning to shift, and Inspector Purbright suspected that the most dramatic revelations were yet to come. The morning brought with it the particular satisfaction that accompanies the discovery of connections previously hidden beneath the surface of ordinary events. Inspector Purbright found himself examining the previous evening's photographic evidence with the methodical attention of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts, noting not merely what the frames contained, but what their careful alterations revealed about institutional memory and its selective editing. The ghost of Penhall, beneath the pasted slip in last year's committee photograph, had become more distinct in the harsh light of morning, a spectral accusation against the carefully constructed facade of impartiality. When he inquired politely of Mrs. Collop about this curious alteration, her composure, usually as unyielding as a well-pruned box hedge, showed the faintest tremor. "Oh, that," she said, waving a dismissive hand with practiced nonchalance. "A mere clerical error. Mr. Penhaligon offered some informal advice that year, purely in an advisory capacity, you understand. Nothing official. We decided it best to have a full committee member listed for appearance's sake. So, Mr. Crask, with his keen eye for detail, stepped in." Her explanation was delivered with practiced smoothness, though Purbright noted the subtle tightening around her eyes that suggested an awareness of performing rather than simply informing. The revelation that Penhaligon had once served in an official capacity while simultaneously competing represented exactly the sort of conflict of interest that would justify the anonymous accusations of irregularities. The afternoon's investigations revealed the full scope of what appeared to be a coordinated campaign rather than individual grievance. Timothy Baxter's modest home, which smelled faintly of damp earth and hopeful ambition, contained his late father's archive in overwhelming detail. Box after box of carefully documented evidence filled what had once been a spare bedroom. Photographs of prize-winning vegetables with detailed measurements, chemical analyses of soil samples, correspondence with agricultural colleges about growing techniques, and most significantly, a comprehensive record of judging decisions that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation. "Father believed in objective data," Timothy explained, his voice carrying the mixture of pride and embarrassment that characterizes those who inherit passionate causes. He kept samples of everything he used, specialized vermiculite, treated with various minerals. Said it gave his plants that extra sheen, but more importantly, it was scientifically measurable. He produced a small labeled jar containing the iridescent grit, identical in appearance to the fragment Purbright had found in the Market Hall office. The connection was both physical and philosophical. Timothy Baxter Sr. had represented the sort of scientific approach to horticulture that challenged traditional judging methods based on subjective preferences and personal relationships. The father's final journal entry, dated just before his passing, contained a bitter yet meticulously documented critique of the previous year's show. It detailed the alleged underscoring of his own prize-winning tomatoes and the surprisingly rapid elevation of Mr. Penhaligon's parsnips from a middling score to first-place triumph, complete with precise timings of when Mr. Henderson had been observed consulting with Penhaligon during the judging. The visit to Dr. Meadows' surgery revealed that gentleman in the process of meticulously cleaning surgical instruments, the familiar scent of antiseptic now mingled with something else, a faint, almost imperceptible aroma of beeswax that connected him to the physical evidence from the cucumber theft. "Dr. Meadows," Purbright began with characteristic mildness, "I understand you have an interest in scientific methods of cultivation." Meadows paused, a scalpel glinting in his hand. "Indeed, Inspector. A fascinating field. Precision, control, optimal conditions. It appeals to the medical mind. One seeks to eliminate variables, to achieve predictable, superior outcomes. The iridescent vermiculite you mentioned, not something one finds in every garden shed. It suggests serious commitment to scientific principles." The doctor's knowledge was both immediate and precise, though his hands showed none of the calluses or ingrained dirt of regular gardening. His interest appeared to be theoretical rather than practical, suggesting someone who might advise others on scientific methods without necessarily implementing them personally. The conversation was interrupted by the sudden, urgent ringing of the town hall bell, followed by the distant clamor of voices. The bell, usually reserved for civic announcements or genuine emergencies, was pealing with frantic, insistent rhythm that drew people from shops and houses throughout Flaxborough. When Purbright arrived in the town square, a crowd had already gathered, their faces displaying the mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension that accompanies public scandal. The source of the commotion was the large glass-fronted notice board outside the town hall, usually reserved for planning applications and announcements of lost pets. Pinned prominently to the center of the board for all of Flaxborough to see was the original leather-bound committee ledger, the very one that had been reported stolen. It lay open at a specific page, held flat by two large, highly polished gladioli that were unmistakably from Mr. Crask's prize-winning display. The page revealed in stark detail the scores from the previous year's show, with Mr. Henderson's preliminary tallies clearly visible alongside the dramatically revised final results. The evidence was undeniable and public. Mr. Penhaligon's vegetables had received modest initial scores that were subsequently elevated to prize-winning levels, while competitors like Mr. Grubb and Timothy Baxter showed the opposite pattern, promising preliminary ratings that somehow diminished in final recording. Attached to the ledger was a new, crisply typed note, secured with a small, perfectly tied clove hitch. "The truth, like a healthy plant, requires light to flourish. Let the records speak for themselves." The concerned citizens of Flaxborough. The plural form was significant, confirming Purbright's growing suspicion that the campaign involved multiple individuals united by shared commitment to fairness rather than personal grievance. The silence that followed the discovery was broken only by the continued agitated pealing of the town hall bell, rung by an unseen hand with theatrical precision. The crowd's reaction revealed the complex loyalties that characterize small communities where personal relationships intersect with public institutions. Mrs. Pettigrew was heard to murmur that she had always wondered about certain results, while Mr. Trotter observed that the evidence spoke for itself. Even Mr. Crask, whose gladioli had been appropriated for the display, seemed more intrigued than offended by their symbolic use. The public nature of this revelation represented a significant escalation from the previous evening's private warnings. Someone had decided that institutional reform required community pressure rather than committee discretion. The carefully orchestrated display suggested people who understood both the power of evidence and the psychology of public opinion. As the crowd gradually dispersed, carrying with them detailed knowledge of the ledger's contents, Inspector Purbright contemplated the investigation's fundamental shift. What had begun as theatrical theft had evolved into systematic exposure of institutional corruption, conducted with precision that suggested both moral conviction and practical competence. The evidence now pointed clearly toward a network of individuals rather than single perpetrator. Timothy Baxter possessed detailed knowledge of the market hall's construction and access to specialized materials. Dr. Meadows provided scientific expertise and theoretical framework for reform. Someone with access to official records, possibly Miss Lyle herself, had preserved evidence of systematic irregularities. The theatrical elements reflected not merely desire for attention but sophisticated understanding of community dynamics. The graduated revelations, the promise of further disclosures, the careful preservation of evidence, all suggested people who hoped to achieve institutional reform rather than personal revenge. As darkness settled over Flaxborough, the town buzzed with conversations about the day's revelations. The public display of the ledger had transformed what might have been dismissed as committee squabbling into community-wide discussion of fairness and accountability. Mrs. Collop's earlier threat to abandon the competition rather than accept reform now seemed less like institutional pride and more like desperate attempt to avoid public embarrassment. The carefully maintained facade of horticultural propriety had been stripped away, revealing the sort of favoritism and corruption that flourishes when authority goes unquestioned. The perpetrators had calculated correctly that private appeals would be ignored, forcing them toward public revelation. The missing correspondence, the photocopied evidence, the theatrical timing, all demonstrated remarkable patience and strategic thinking in pursuit of what they considered justice. Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the delicate balance between institutional stability and moral accountability. The evidence of judging irregularities was compelling, but the methods used to expose them raised questions about anonymous accusation and vigilante investigation. The cucumber had served its purpose as symbol and catalyst, but the real test would come when the community was forced to choose between confronting uncomfortable truths about its most cherished institution or maintaining comfortable illusions at the cost of genuine fairness. The town faced a reckoning that extended far beyond horticultural politics, touching the very foundations of trust and integrity that made civic life possible. And Inspector Purbright suspected that the most significant revelations were yet to come in what promised to be a most methodical campaign for institutional reform. The second incident had shifted the investigation irrevocably from private grievance to public accountability, and there was no returning to the comfortable certainties that had once governed Flaxborough's civic life. The morning brought with it the particular satisfaction that accompanies the discovery of connections previously hidden beneath the surface of ordinary events. Inspector Purbright found himself examining the aftermath of the ledger's public display with the methodical attention of a scholar studying the ripple effects of dropped stones in still water. Flaxborough moved with the delicate caution of a town that had discovered its most cherished assumptions might be built on rather shakier foundations than previously supposed. The Market Hall Square bustled with an energy that transcended mere curiosity. Mrs. Higgins's corner shop had become an impromptu tribunal where the ledger's revelations were dissected with the thoroughness of a medical examination. The evidence was undeniable. Mr. Penhaligon's vegetables had received modest initial scores that were subsequently elevated to prize-winning levels, while competitors like Mr. Grubb and Timothy Baxter showed the opposite pattern, promising preliminary ratings that somehow diminished in final recording. In the quiet of his office, Inspector Purbright arranged the accumulated evidence with the methodical care of a chess player contemplating his endgame. The case had evolved far beyond simple theft into something approaching a philosophical examination of justice, accountability, and the delicate balance between institutional stability and moral reform. The perpetrators had demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their approach, understanding that lasting change required community support rather than mere exposure of wrongdoing. The technical competence displayed in the cucumber's theatrical return, combined with a sophisticated understanding of community psychology evident in the ledger's public display, pointed toward individuals with diverse skills united by common cause. The scientific precision of Timothy Baxter's inherited evidence, the medical exactness, suggested by various clues, the administrative access that had preserved official records, all suggested a conspiracy of competence rather than mere grievance. What struck him most profoundly was the perpetrators' remarkable restraint. They possessed, clearly, far more evidence than they had revealed, yet they had chosen graduated disclosure rather than immediate exposure. This suggested people who hoped for voluntary reform rather than institutional destruction, though their patience appeared to be approaching its limits. The morning's first interview took place in Mr. Henderson's bank office, where that gentleman received Purbright with the wounded dignity of a man whose professional competence had been publicly questioned. The banker's usual composure showed signs of strain, his spectacles requiring frequent adjustment as he struggled to maintain his institutional authority. "Inspector," Henderson began, his voice carrying a note of weary resignation, "I suppose you've come about those irregularities in the ledger. I should tell you that adjustments were made, rarely, and only to correct outcomes that might have seemed unflattering to the show's standing. You must understand that a certain distribution of prizes ensures the competition maintains its reputation for recognizing genuine excellence. The admission was both significant and carefully worded, acknowledging manipulation while justifying it as institutional necessity." Henderson's hands moved restlessly among the papers on his desk, straightening documents that were already perfectly aligned, a gesture that spoke of discomfort beneath his professional facade. "When did these adjustments typically occur?" Purbright inquired with characteristic mildness. "After preliminary judging, during the consultative phase. Mr. Penhaligon and I have been friends for years, business associates, naturally. His expertise in cultivation methods often provided valuable perspective on technical matters that might escape casual observation. The explanation possessed the sort of bureaucratic plausibility that might satisfy those who preferred comfortable rationalizations to uncomfortable truths. Yet the specific patterns revealed in the ledger suggested systematic bias rather than occasional consultation. The afternoon brought a discovery that shifted the investigation in an unexpected direction. W.P.C. Dunn's observation about the disinfectant smear on the town hall notice board had led to a more thorough examination of the scene. The substance proved to be a medical-grade antiseptic, the sort used in surgical procedures rather than ordinary cleaning. More significantly, microscopic analysis revealed traces of the same iridescent vermiculite that had been found in the Market Hall office, suggesting that whoever had handled the medical materials had also been in contact with the specialized horticultural grit. The connection pointed towards someone with access to both medical supplies and advanced growing materials, a combination that narrowed the field considerably. Dr. Meadows, when questioned about the medical antiseptic, displayed the sort of professional interest that might be expected from someone in his position, though Purbright noted a certain tension in his manner that had not been present in previous interviews. "Medical-grade disinfectant, you say? Curious place to find it, though I suppose anyone might obtain such materials from a chemist, given sufficient determination. The iridescent vermiculite is more interesting. That suggests someone with serious commitment to scientific cultivation methods. The day's most important development came from an unexpected source. Miss Lyle, arriving at the police station as evening approached, brought with her a manila folder that she placed on Purbright's desk with the careful precision that characterized all her actions. "Inspector," she said, her usual composure disturbed by obvious moral distress. "I feel I must show you this." It was hidden beneath the typewriter, placed there sometime after the ledger disappeared, I believe. I discovered it this morning when cleaning the office thoroughly. The folder contained photocopies of correspondence between Mr. Henderson and various agricultural suppliers, detailing purchases of specialized fertilizers and growing compounds that had been delivered not to the bank or Henderson's residence, but to a post office box registered under a false name. The invoices showed quantities far exceeding any reasonable domestic gardening needs, and several items matched exactly the chemical composition of materials found in Mr. Penhaligon's prize-winning vegetables. More damaging still was a series of handwritten notes in Henderson's characteristic script, detailing meetings with Penhaligon to discuss optimal presentation strategies and ensuring appropriate recognition of superior specimens. The notes made clear that the judging irregularities were not occasional adjustments, but systematic manipulation designed to guarantee predetermined outcomes. "Miss Lyle," Purbright observed carefully, "this represents evidence of considerable significance. How long have you been aware of these arrangements?" Her response was delivered with the honesty that had made her invaluable to 3 successive committee chairmen. "One notices patterns, Inspector, when one maintains records over many years. The consistency of certain results, the predictability of certain outcomes. A secretary learns to anticipate such things, though one's observations are not officially solicited. I preserved these documents because someone should know the truth, even if it could not be officially acknowledged." The evening brought the final pieces of the puzzle into focus. The evidence now pointed clearly toward a network of individuals rather than a single perpetrator. Timothy Baxter possessed detailed knowledge of the market hall's construction and access to specialized materials. Dr. Meadows provided scientific expertise and access to medical supplies. Miss Lyle had preserved crucial evidence and maintained official records. Each contributed different skills to a coordinated campaign for institutional reform. The theatrical elements reflected not merely desire for attention but sophisticated understanding of community dynamics. The graduated revelations, the promise of further disclosures, the careful preservation of evidence, all demonstrated people who hoped to achieve lasting reform rather than temporary embarrassment. As darkness settled over Flaxborough, the town buzzed with conversations about the day's revelations. The public display of the ledger had transformed what might have been dismissed as committee squabbling into community-wide discussion of fairness and accountability. Mrs. Collop's earlier threats to abandon the competition rather than accept reform now seemed less like institutional pride and more like desperate attempts to avoid public embarrassment. The carefully maintained facade of horticultural propriety had been stripped away, revealing the sort of favoritism and corruption that flourishes when authority goes unquestioned. The perpetrators had calculated correctly that private appeals would be ignored, forcing them toward public revelation while maintaining careful control over the pace and scope of disclosure. As Inspector Purbright prepared for another evening of observation, he reflected on the investigation's evolution from simple theft to complex examination of civic accountability. The missing elements of the puzzle were resolving themselves into a coherent pattern, but one crucial question remained. What final revelation did the concerned citizens plan to make? The evidence suggested they possessed information that would complete their case beyond any possibility of denial or rationalization. The systematic nature of their campaign, the careful timing of each disclosure, the promise of more detailed revelations, all pointed toward a climactic revelation that would force the community to choose between confronting uncomfortable truths and retreating into comfortable denial. The cucumber had served its purpose as catalyst and symbol, but the real work of justice was approaching its crucial moment. The question was no longer simply who had orchestrated the elaborate campaign, but what final truth they intended to reveal and whether Flaxborough would prove capable of the moral courage necessary to embrace genuine reform. The town faced a reckoning that extended far beyond horticultural politics, touching the very foundations of trust and integrity that made civic life possible. And Inspector Purbright suspected that the most significant test of Flaxborough's character was scheduled to arrive with the next stroke of midnight. The delicate balance of civic respectability was shifting irrevocably, and the approaching climax would determine not merely the future of the horticultural show, but the very nature of accountability and justice in a community that had long preferred comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. The morning brought with it the particular satisfaction that accompanies the discovery of connections previously hidden beneath the surface of ordinary events. Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the intricate social machinery of Flaxborough, now thrown into delightful disarray by the public airing of its horticultural peccadilloes. The town moved with the cautious dignity of a dowager who had discovered her petticoat was showing, attempting to maintain composure while quietly adjusting the offending garment. Mrs. Collop's morning constitutional through the market square possessed a defensive quality that had not been present before. Her usual regal progress past the various shops and establishments now carried the air of someone expecting challenge at any moment, like a general reviewing troops who might, at any moment, decide to mutiny. The deference that had once greeted her horticultural pronouncements had been replaced by the sort of polite attention accorded to figures whose authority has become a matter of public debate. The morning strategy sessions with Sergeant Love had produced a plan of elegant simplicity, though Purbright was careful not to describe it in such terms to his subordinate, who had a tendency to become suspicious of anything that sounded too clever by half. Rather than continue pursuing evidence through the usual channels of interrogation and forensic analysis, Purbright had decided to create circumstances that would encourage the perpetrators to reveal themselves through their own responses to carefully applied pressure. The approach required delicate timing and considerable faith in human psychology, qualities that Purbright had cultivated through years of observing how people behaved when they believed themselves unobserved. It was rather like tending a garden, he reflected. One created the proper conditions and then waited for natural processes to produce the desired results. He began by arranging for certain information to circulate through Flaxborough's intricate network of informal communication. Mrs. Higgins, whose corner shop served as the town's primary intelligence exchange, was quietly informed that the police had identified the concerned citizens and were preparing to make arrests unless the perpetrators presented themselves voluntarily. The news was delivered with the sort of casual confidence that suggested official knowledge while avoiding specific accusations. The second element of his strategy involved a series of carefully worded invitations to what he described as a consultative meeting regarding the future of the horticultural show. The gathering was scheduled for that evening in the market hall's committee room, a space that normally exuded the comfortable mustiness of civic responsibility, but which now seemed charged with the potential for dramatic revelation. The invitations were extended with the usual civic courtesy, though each was crafted with particular attention to the recipient's psychology. To Mr. Henderson, the embattled chairman, Purbright suggested that his presence would be essential for regularizing the record and restoring public confidence. To Mrs. Collop, he appealed to her natural authority and suggested that her guidance would be crucial for implementing necessary reforms. Mr. Penhaligon received an invitation that delicately implied his reputation might benefit from public demonstration of commitment to fairness over personal advantage. Miss Lyle was asked to attend in her capacity as committee secretary, with particular emphasis on her invaluable knowledge of procedural matters and historical precedents. Dr. Meadows was invited to provide scientific perspective on proposed reforms, while Timothy Baxter received what appeared to be a courtesy invitation for a representative of the younger generation. Mr. Crask was asked to contribute his keen eye for detail, and even Mr. Holroyd was included on the grounds that any public matter undertaken in the evening hours might benefit from his particular brand of calm authority. Each invitation contained subtle implications that the recipient's cooperation would be both expected and remembered, while their absence might be interpreted as suggesting something to hide. The day passed with the sort of heightened awareness that characterizes communities on the verge of significant events. Conversations in shops and offices carried undertones of speculation and anxiety as people attempted to divine the likely outcome of the evening's gathering. The cucumber affair had evolved from amusing scandal to serious examination of civic integrity, and the town was beginning to understand that the resolution might require uncomfortable adjustments to long-held assumptions. Mr. Penhaligon spent the day in his hardware store with the air of a man under siege, his usual confident demeanor replaced by defensive wariness. His conversations with customers carried undertones of injured dignity, as if he were personally affronted by suggestions that excellence might be achieved through anything other than merit. Mr. Henderson had retreated into his bank office with the sort of dignified withdrawal that characterized his response to all unpleasant situations. His secretary reported that he was reviewing procedural matters related to the show, though the specific nature of these reviews remained carefully unspecified. As 8 o'clock approached, the market hall's committee room filled with an atmosphere of expectant tension. The usual scent of stale tea and forgotten good intentions had been replaced by something sharper, the electric charge that precedes thunderstorms or significant confessions. Inspector Purbright took his position at the head of the polished table with the sort of calm authority that suggested he was about to conduct a routine meeting rather than orchestrate a psychological examination. He noted the positioning of various individuals within the room, observing how suspected participants had arranged themselves to maintain visual contact while avoiding obvious association. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the measured tones that commanded attention without demanding it. "We are gathered this evening to discuss matters that concern not merely the theft of a prize cucumber, but the fundamental principles that govern our civic institutions." The silence that followed was profound, charged with the sort of expectant tension that precedes significant revelations. Purbright allowed it to extend for several moments, using the pause to observe the subtle reactions of those he suspected were most directly involved. "The investigation has revealed a most interesting pattern," he continued, his tone suggesting mild academic curiosity rather than accusation. "The anonymous communications, the sophisticated understanding of institutional procedures, the remarkable coordination of timing and execution all suggest individuals with diverse skills united by common purpose." He directed his attention first to the technical aspects of the case, noting how the specialized materials and equipment required for the cucumber's theatrical return pointed towards someone with access to both horticultural supplies and mechanical expertise. The iridescent vermiculite, the medical-grade antiseptic, the precise knotwork, each element suggested specific knowledge and resources. "Dr. Meadows," he observed with casual interest, "your professional training would naturally provide appreciation for precision and systematic methodology. One might say that the entire campaign demonstrated remarkably scientific approach to evidence gathering and presentation." Meadows met his gaze with professional composure, though Purbright noted a slight tightening around his eyes. "Scientific method, Inspector, requires objective analysis and careful documentation, admirable qualities in any investigation, whether medical or otherwise." "Indeed," Purbright agreed, turning his attention to Timothy Baxter. "And practical skills, rope work, mechanical systems, detailed knowledge of building construction, Such capabilities would prove invaluable for anyone wishing to orchestrate theatrical effects with precision timing. Timothy's response carried the enthusiasm of youth combined with careful restraint. "My father always emphasized the importance of practical education, sir. Understanding how things work, being able to solve problems with available resources. He said it was the foundation of true independence." As the evening progressed, Purbright's questions became increasingly specific, though never quite crossing the line into direct accusation. He mentioned the committee typewriter's distinctive characteristics, the careful timing of various revelations, the sophisticated understanding of community psychology that had guided the entire campaign. Miss Lyle maintained her composed dignity throughout, though Purbright detected subtle signs of internal conflict. Her responses carried the precision that had made her invaluable to successive committee chairmen, but also a new quality, the sort of moral certainty that comes from acting according to deeply held principles. "The preservation of institutional records," she observed when questioned about the missing ledger, "requires both technical competence and ethical commitment. One might argue that sometimes the greatest service to an institution involves protecting it from its own shortcomings." As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Purbright made his intentions clear with characteristic understatement. "The evidence suggests," he said, his tone carrying quiet authority, "that the concerned citizens of Flaxborough acted from genuine commitment to fairness and institutional integrity. Their methods, while technically irregular, demonstrated remarkable restraint and sophisticated understanding of both evidence and community dynamics." The silence that followed was complete, charged with the recognition that the moment of decision had arrived. Each person present understood that they were being offered a choice between continued deception and the possibility of resolution that acknowledged both wrongdoing and the legitimate desire for reform. Inspector Purbright stood quietly in the committee room, surrounded by the accumulated tension of the evening's careful revelations. Outside, Flaxborough settled into its customary evening rhythms, unaware that in this small, mustily respectable room, the future of its most cherished institution hung in the balance. The test had been administered with surgical precision. Now it remained to be seen whether those involved would choose confession or continued concealment, and whether the community would prove capable of the moral courage necessary to embrace genuine reform over comfortable illusion. The cucumber had served its purpose as catalyst and symbol, but the real work of justice was approaching its crucial moment. The question was no longer simply who had orchestrated the elaborate campaign, but whether Flaxborough possessed the wisdom to transform scandal into genuine improvement. The evening's most significant revelation was yet to come, and Inspector Purbright suspected that the next few minutes would determine not merely the resolution of a curious crime, but the character of the community itself. The delicate balance between order and accountability, between loyalty and truth, between institutional stability and moral courage, these were the issues that would define Flaxborough's response to its moment of reckoning. The clock on the committee room wall ticked steadily toward the hour of decision, while in the charged silence, the future of civic integrity awaited the outcome of one final, crucial test of human nature. The silence that followed Inspector Purbright's carefully measured observations possessed the particular quality that precedes significant confessions, not the empty quiet of absence, but the charged stillness of accumulated tension seeking release. He allowed it to extend for several moments, using the pause to observe the subtle reactions of those he suspected were most directly involved, noting how Timothy Baxter's hands had stilled on the table, how Dr. Meadows had assumed the composed posture of a man preparing for a difficult diagnosis, and how Miss Lyle sat with the dignity of someone whose conscience had finally been given permission to speak. "Very well," Purbright said at last, in a tone so unthreatening that it suggested a discussion of weather patterns rather than criminal conspiracy. Let us set out the matters of fact, and then we may consider what they mean." He did not look at anyone in particular as he began, which had the effect of making everyone feel observed. First, the cucumber, removed during a momentary distraction, returned by means of a simple but well-contrived apparatus. Pulleys in the roof space, rope treated with beeswax, an old stage trick refined by care. The release was arranged to coincide with midnight and made obedient to the town clock by way of the old fire station bell. Purbright's gaze settled briefly on Timothy Baxter, whose youthful enthusiasm was beginning to overcome his careful restraint. The mechanical precision required suggests someone with considerable knowledge of the market hall's construction, knowledge that might come from, say, Sea Scout meetings held in these premises. The clove hitch used to secure the envelope to the returned cucumber was executed with the sort of competence that speaks of proper instruction and regular practice. Timothy drew breath. It made rather a large sound in the quiet room. His eyes brightened with the sort of pride that comes from having one's technical skills properly recognized, even under such circumstances. "The specialized materials present an interesting pattern," Purbright continued, producing a small evidence envelope. "Iridescent vermiculite, not commonly found in domestic gardens, but essential for advanced hydroponic cultivation, the sort of material a scientifically minded horticulturist might use or inherit from a father who believed in objective measurement over traditional methods." He allowed his attention to drift toward Dr. Meadows. Medical-grade antiseptic found on the town hall notice board suggests someone whose professional habits include sterilizing surfaces, perhaps to remove the traces of less fastidious collaborators. A curious professional signature to leave behind. Dr. Meadows met his gaze with the calm attention of a physician receiving a colleague's diagnosis. "An unfortunate oversight," he admitted quietly, though one might argue that the pursuit of truth occasionally requires clinical precision. "The typewritten communications," Purbright observed, "all bear the characteristic mark of the market hall office machine. That courteous little bow of the letter E that makes even accusations seem polite. Access to this machine, as Miss Lyle can attest, is neither restricted nor recorded. Committee members, maintenance staff, even scout leaders borrowing the hall, all might find occasion to use it." Miss Lyle's composure, usually as unyielding as a well-pruned hedge, showed the faintest tremor. "One's duty to institutional integrity," she said with characteristic precision, "sometimes conflicts with one's duty to institutional loyalty. When such conflicts arise, one must choose according to deeper principles." Her admission was delivered with the quiet authority that had made her invaluable to successive committee chairmen, though now it served truth rather than comfortable convenience. "The missing ledger," Purbright continued, "was not stolen to be hidden, but to be revealed. Its public display outside the town hall was prepared for maximum clarity and minimum fuss. Even the flowers chosen to keep the book flat were appropriate. Mr. Krask's gladioli, whose military bearing lent a certain pageantry to mere paper." Mr. Krask inclined his head graciously. "One is pleased to serve truth, Inspector, even inadvertently." "The evidence within the ledger speaks for itself," Purbright said, his tone carrying the weight of undeniable fact. Mr. Penhaligon's vegetables received modest initial scores that were subsequently elevated to prize-winning levels, while competitors like Mr. Grubb and the late Mr. Baxter showed the opposite pattern, promising preliminary ratings that somehow diminished in final recording. Dr. Meadows was the first to break the silence that followed, his medical training having taught him to recognize when denial becomes more harmful than acknowledgement. "Inspector," he said, placing his hands flat on the table with deliberate precision, "I believe the time has come for complete honesty. The investigation you describe was indeed coordinated by concerned citizens, citizens who felt that private appeals to authority had proven insufficient to address documented irregularities. Timothy Baxter's youthful idealism finally overcame his restraint. We tried talking to people privately first, sir. My father's records showed clear patterns of unfair judging, but no one wanted to listen. They said it was just sour grapes, that we should accept the committee's decisions gracefully. His voice carried the frustrated conviction of someone who had discovered that institutional authority does not always align with institutional justice. The cucumber theft was my idea originally. I knew the hall's construction, understood how to rig the pulley system, but Dr. Meadows provided the scientific framework for our evidence, and Miss Lyle preserved the records that proved our case. Miss Lyle maintained her composed dignity as she added her voice to the confession. The preservation of institutional records requires both technical competence and ethical commitment. One might argue that sometimes the greatest service to an institution involves protecting it from its own shortcomings. Her words carried the weight of years spent maintaining official documentation while watching truth be quietly edited for convenience. The revelation that even the committee secretary, the show's institutional memory, had been complicit in exposing the corruption struck at the heart of what had made the competition meaningful. We never intended permanent theft, Timothy added with obvious sincerity. The cucumber was borrowed, not stolen. We wanted to make a point about institutional accountability, not cause genuine harm. Throughout these revelations, Mr. Henderson had maintained the sort of dignified silence that characterized his response to all unpleasant banking situations. Now, faced with complete exposure, he seemed to deflate slightly, his usual authoritative posture giving way to resignation. "Inspector," he said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated compromise, "I suppose I should explain my own role in these arrangements. The adjustments to judging scores were made with the best intentions, to ensure that the show maintained its reputation for recognizing genuine excellence. The explanation possessed bureaucratic plausibility, while the documented evidence suggested systematic bias rather than occasional consultation. Mr. Penhaligon's expertise in cultivation methods provided valuable perspective on the technical matters. Our friendship, our business relationship, naturally led to discussions about optimal presentation strategies. Purbright folded his hands with the air of a man reaching the conclusion of a complex equation. What strikes me most about this affair is not the irregularities themselves. Such arrangements are regrettably common in institutions where oversight is minimal, but the remarkable restraint shown by those who exposed them. He looked around the room, his gaze encompassing both the conspirators and their targets. The concerned citizens possessed, clearly, far more evidence than they revealed. They could have destroyed reputations, ended careers, caused genuine harm. Instead, they chose graduated disclosure, hoping for voluntary reform rather than institutional destruction. The silence that followed carried the weight of collective recognition. The cucumber had been returned as promised. The ledger had been displayed, not destroyed. Even the theatrical elements had been designed to provoke thought rather than cause chaos. "We come then," Purbright said, his tone suggesting mild academic interest rather than judicial pronouncement, to the question of what is to be done. The law has words for theft, conspiracy, interference with records, but the law also allows a community to find its sense, to repair its own behavior when it can. He looked at Mrs. Collop, whose authority had spent the week diminishing by degrees. "Madame, you have the capacity to devise a system of judging that will be both strict and publicly credible. Blind judging might be accomplished by numbers rather than names, with judges from neighboring towns who have no local connections to influence their decisions." Mrs. Collop, who had never been asked to surrender authority in so polite a way, discovered that the movement of her head in acknowledgement did not cause pain. "It can be done," she said. "It will be done." "Mr. Henderson," Purbright continued, "you will withdraw from any position touching the competition. It is astonishing how much confidence returns to a room from which a compromised chair has been removed." Henderson swallowed dignity with visible effort. if it serves the town's interests. Mr. Penhaligon, you will refrain from entering your produce this coming year. You may lend your expertise to educational purposes if you wish, but for a season you will content yourself with being admired in private. As for the conspirators, Purbright's tone carried a note of something approaching approval. You have broken small laws to defend a larger one, that a contest be honest and that honors be fairly bestowed. You will prepare letters, signed in your own names, explaining your actions to the community. Mr. Winch at the Advertiser will treat them fairly. He appreciates well-constructed sentences and proper punctuation. Timothy Baxter drew himself up with the inflexible honesty of youth. We only wanted it to be fair, sir. I know, said Purbright, and it will be. It is one of the advantages of small towns that when they are wrong, they can sometimes be put right by very small means. A cucumber descending at midnight, for example. There was a faint, reluctant ripple of amusement that ran around the table and softened several faces. Finally, Purbright added, as if the thought had just occurred to him, Mr. Grubb is owed an apology. Not because he deserves everything he thinks, which would be a great mischief to the town, but because for once he thought something that happened to be true. As the meeting concluded and chairs scraped politely against the floor, Miss Lyle paused at the threshold. Inspector, she said simply, I should be grateful if you would not call it a conspiracy. It was. A tidying up. Then let us settle on that, Purbright replied. We have removed a tangle. Tidiness is, after all, a virtue one may safely admire. They went out into the square where the market hall clock prepared to announce the hour with its customary reliability. Behind them, the committee room settled back into its usual mustiness, though somehow it seemed to breathe more easily, as if a weight had been lifted from its institutional shoulders. The cucumber case was drawing to its close, not with dramatic arrests or thundering accusations, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from truth carefully revealed and justice thoughtfully applied. Tomorrow, Flaxborough would begin the work of rebuilding trust in its most cherished institution, one honest judgment at a time. The morning brought with it the particular satisfaction that accompanies the discovery that a community can, when properly motivated, demonstrate remarkable capacity for moral adjustment without sacrificing its essential dignity. Inspector Purbright found himself examining Flaxborough's response to the previous evening's revelations with the methodical attention of a botanist observing how carefully tended soil responds to appropriate cultivation, noting not merely what had grown, but how the process itself had revealed unexpected reserves of civic wisdom. The town moved with the cautious optimism of a dowager who had discovered that admitting to a small indiscretion had enhanced rather than diminished her reputation. The market square bustled with conversations that carried undertones of relief rather than recrimination, as people began to understand that scandal need not inevitably lead to permanent damage when addressed with appropriate honesty and a proper regard for everyone's feelings. The morning's post brought the promised letters from the concerned citizens, delivered to the Flaxborough Advertiser with the punctuality that had characterized their entire campaign. Mr. Winch received them with the professional satisfaction of an editor who recognizes genuine news when it arrives properly formatted, grammatically correct, and unlikely to provoke lawsuits. Timothy Baxter's contribution possessed the earnest clarity of youth combined with careful respect for institutional authority, a combination that suggested either excellent upbringing or considerable coaching from Dr. Meadows. He explained his father's scientific approach to horticulture, the documented evidence of judging irregularities, and the group's decision to pursue theatrical revelation when private appeals proved as effective as requesting better weather through prayer. We never intended theft, he wrote with characteristic directness, but rather borrowed the cucumber to serve as symbol of our concern for fairness. The elaborate return was designed to demonstrate that our quarrel was with institutional practices, not individual property. The letter concluded with an apology that managed to sound both sincere and slightly proud of its own technical competence. Dr. Meadows's letter displayed the clinical precision that marked his professional work, though applied to matters of civic rather than medical diagnosis. His prose carried the sort of measured authority that made even his most pointed observations sound like friendly consultations. Medical practice teaches one to distinguish between symptoms and underlying conditions, he noted with characteristic exactness. The cucumber's disappearance was merely symptomatic of deeper institutional irregularities that required systematic treatment rather than cosmetic remedy. Miss Lyle's contribution possessed the quiet authority that had made her invaluable to successive committee chairmen, though now deployed in service of truth rather than comfortable convenience. Her explanation of preserving official records and supporting reform when institutional loyalty conflicted with professional integrity was delivered with the sort of understated moral courage that made dramatic gestures seem rather vulgar by comparison. The publication of these explanations produced the sort of thoughtful discussion that characterizes communities confronting uncomfortable truths about cherished institutions. Mrs. Higgins's corner shop had become an impromptu tribunal where the revelations were dissected with the thoroughness usually reserved for examining the quality of imported biscuits. Mrs. Collop, whose authority had been both challenged and ultimately strengthened by the crisis, embraced her new role with the efficiency of a general who had discovered that strategic retreat could be more effective than stubborn defense. Her announcements regarding blind judging and external adjudicators were delivered with the sort of brisk competence that suggested she had always intended such reforms and was merely waiting for an appropriate moment to implement them. Mr. Henderson's withdrawal from committee responsibilities was accomplished with the dignified silence that characterized his response to all unpleasant banking situations. He was occasionally sighted walking his terrier with an air of quiet contemplation, his spectacles reflecting the autumn light as if seeking new, less complicated horizons. His absence from various civic functions was noted but tactfully unmentioned, in the manner of well-bred people acknowledging a relative's unfortunate but temporary indisposition. Mr. Penhaligon discovered unexpected solace in his enforced retirement from competition. His hardware store became an informal academy where he dispensed horticultural wisdom with the generous air of a man whose expertise was finally being appreciated for its own sake, rather than its competitive advantages. The true joy of cultivation, he was heard to observe, lies not in defeating one's neighbors, but in achieving excellence that speaks for itself. Even Septimus Grubb found himself in the curious position of having been proven right, a sensation so unfamiliar that he required several days to adjust to it properly. His acceptance of Mrs. Collop's formal apology was delivered with the sort of magnanimous dignity usually reserved for accepting surrender from particularly obstinate creditors. The implementation of reforms proceeded with the methodical precision that characterized all successful institutional adjustments in Flaxborough. Blind judging would ensure anonymity, external adjudicators would eliminate local bias, and detailed scoring criteria would be published in advance with the transparency of a railway timetable. Dr. Meadows found himself appointed to oversee the technical aspects of the new system, his scientific expertise now officially recognized rather than merely tolerated. Timothy Baxter was invited to demonstrate proper knot-tying techniques to the Sea Scouts, his mechanical skills having acquired a certain legendary status among the younger generation. Miss Lyle resumed her duties with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose conscience had been publicly vindicated. Her meticulous record-keeping now carried the additional weight of moral authority, and her presence served as a permanent reminder that institutional memory could be both preserved and properly employed. As evening approached, Inspector Purbright found himself contemplating the case's resolution with the quiet satisfaction that comes from witnessing justice achieved through community wisdom rather than legal compulsion. The cucumber affair had evolved from theatrical theft into profound examination of institutional integrity, revealing both the fragility and resilience of civic trust. The perpetrators had demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their approach to reform, understanding that lasting change required community support rather than mere exposure of wrongdoing. Their graduated revelations, careful documentation, and theatrical timing had created conditions for voluntary improvement rather than defensive reaction, a lesson in applied psychology that might have impressed even the most experienced practitioners of that uncertain science. The community's response had proven equally sophisticated, choosing honest examination over comfortable denial, institutional reform over individual punishment. The reforms implemented would ensure future fairness while preserving the show's essential character and community value, a balance as delicate as any prize-winning bloom. The market hall stood quiet in the square as darkness settled over Flaxborough, its windows reflecting the streetlights with a sort of watchful dignity that suggested institutional wisdom properly applied. Inside, the committee room had been restored to its usual mustiness, though it seemed to breathe more easily, as if a weight had been lifted from its civic shoulders. The case had revealed fundamental truths about the nature of justice in small communities. That fairness requires constant vigilance, that institutions serve communities rather than the reverse, and that moral courage can be demonstrated through precise action rather than grand gestures. The cucumber had served its purpose as catalyst and symbol, but the real achievement lay in the community's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and implement necessary reforms without sacrificing the essential civility that made such adjustments possible. Inspector Purbright completed his final paperwork with the methodical attention he brought to all professional responsibilities. The official record would note theft and return, conspiracy and resolution, institutional irregularities and systematic reform. But the deeper story, the triumph of community wisdom over individual convenience, of justice over comfort, of truth over reputation, would live in Flaxborough's collective memory as an example of what could be accomplished when citizens chose courage over complacency, though naturally without making too much fuss about it. He closed the file, turned down his desk lamp, and prepared to return to the comfortable routines of ordinary police work. Tomorrow would bring the usual complaints about missing garden implements and disputes over boundary hedges, the sort of predictable difficulties that made even prize cucumber theft seem almost exotic by comparison. The town settled into evening with the peaceful satisfaction that follows difficult tasks successfully completed. Behind curtains throughout Flaxborough, people were preparing for next year's competition with renewed enthusiasm, knowing that their efforts would be judged fairly and their achievements recognized according to genuine merit rather than institutional convenience. The delicate balance between individual excellence and community fairness had been restored through careful attention to both justice and mercy. A very English solution to a very English problem. The cucumber case had become more than investigation. It had become education in the possibilities of civic renewal when guided by wisdom, restraint, and a proper regard for everyone's dignity. Inspector Purbright locked his office door and stepped into the square, where the market hall clock prepared to announce the hour with its customary reliability. The old fire bell remained appropriately silent, its rope coiled with the sort of seaman-like precision that suggested Timothy Baxter's influence. In houses throughout the town, citizens who had witnessed scandal transform into strength were settling into evening routines with the quiet confidence that comes from institutions tested and found capable of improvement. The cucumber had been returned, the truth had been revealed, and justice had been achieved through the most civilized of methods. Polite persistence, careful documentation, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from setting things right without unnecessary drama. It was, Purbright reflected as he walked home past the peacefully darkened shops, a very Flaxborough sort of resolution to a very Flaxborough sort of mystery. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure in the collective memory of a community that had chosen truth over comfort and emerged stronger for the choice. and if certain people still spoke of murder at midnight, the phrase now meant no more than the tidy elimination of an old bad habit, which was, when properly considered, the most satisfactory sort of murder of all. The end.